Hi, and welcome to this edition of Studio 411. I'm your host, Larry Dasilva, and we've got an interesting show today here with a little bit of a local flavor. We've got gentleman William J. Ryczek to my left here, who's author of several books, primarily in the sports genre, and one of Bill's more recent books called Connecticut Gridiron, Football Minor Leaguers of the 1960s and the 1970s. And this narrative history of minor league football in Connecticut during that time, basically from about 1962 to about 1973-74, is based on extensive newspaper and periodical research and interviews with nearly 70 former players, broadcasters, and journalists. And a very interesting read, to say the least. And we welcome to Studio 411 Bill Ryczek. Bill, how are you?
I'm very good. Thank you for having me, Larry.
Thank you. Appreciate you coming on. Tell me, this from reading this book, this was like a labor of love, and I know you've written some other books that certainly have piqued my interest, many to do with baseball, but we're kind of in the same age bracket. Growing up where I did, I never saw them play, but would read in the old Bridgeport Post-Telegram when it was, we used to have a morning and afternoon newspaper about the Bridgeport Jets, which was owned by the Dario family. Right. And I get the impression you were very much indoctrinated into the minor league football with the Hartford Knights, which I must say, not to us as a kid, from Bridgeport to Hartford, that was like another world. So, you know, it wasn't until I moved up here some 15, 20 years ago that I started hearing Hartford Knights, Hartford Knights. I'm like, what's that? Well, this book crystallizes what I should have known as a child. So how did this book all come about, the idea for it?
When you were watching or hearing about the Bridgeport Jets or reading about the Bridgeport Jets, I was listening to the Hartford Knights on the radio, because in those days there wasn't a lot of football or any sports on television and not a lot on the radio. Now you can get 20 games, 20 football games a Saturday. Then it was usually one college game. So any sports that was on, I would generally watch or listen to. And the Hartford Knights were on most Saturday nights in 1968, which was their first year. I started listening to every game. And then probably by 69, I started doing other things. I was getting to be 16, 17, doing other things. But for about a year and a half, I listened to just about every game with Arnold Dean and Lou Palmer. And later on, so when I got to thinking about it, it was 2009 I started researching it. Just wanted to go back, and I was thinking about writing about the Knights' 68 season. I said, nah, that's not enough to keep a book going. So let's talk about the Knights. And then you get into it and you start finding out, what about the Jets? What about the Ansonia team? What about the Meriden team? And it just kind of expanded to all of Connecticut. And got to interview both Arnold Dean, who, as you know, unfortunately has passed away since then, and Lou Palmer, who were the people who brought the Hartford Knights to me.
I didn't know Lou had passed, but...
No, Lou had not. Arnold did.
Oh, Arnold did.
No,
okay.
Lou is still alive. Lou's in Florida.
Gotcha.
And we did a reunion of the Hartford Knights. It was about I think 2012 maybe, because when I was doing these interviews, I'd talk to someone and they'd say, well, where's Joe? Did I talk to Joe? Yeah, Joe's living in Florida. How about Pete? Well, Pete's down in Ansonia. And I had all this contact information. So we said, why don't we see if we can get everybody together? And most of these guys had not seen each other in 40 years. A few of them kept in touch, but most of them did not. They played. When their football days were ended, they never kept in touch. So we got together at the Cantina restaurant in Middletown, about 25 people, and it was one of the best nights you would ever experience. These guys were so excited. Picture a bunch of guys in their 60s and 70s, had shared this great bond together of playing football. And when you play, it's like being in the Army almost. You have that bond, you grow together, but then you grow apart when it's over. They reconnected. And it was, people were just standing there smiling. See these big, burly, 75-year-old guys.
While you're looking at it from, like, you know, kind of flashing back to, you know, a young teenager, and you're like, wow, this is great. It'd be like being at a behind-the-scenes rock reunion concert. And meanwhile, here's an example where these folks 10 times more appreciated even than you could have in your wildest dreams, because, you know, again, it was like perfect analogy, old Army buddies, old warriors getting back together. Yeah.
And just seeing them so happy made me happy. And we were down at the end of the table. There was the three non-players, Arnold Dean, me, and Dennis Randall, who was the sports editor of the Hartford Times. And I told Lou Palmer afterwards, I don't know if I've ever seen a human being as happy as Arnold was that night. His wife had just passed away a few months before that, and he passed away a few months after that. But he was so happy to be there. He sent me an email afterwards telling me what a great night it was. And to see him and here's somebody who brought me a lot of pleasure in my youth. Sure. And anybody who grew up in Connecticut, if you didn't know what Arnold Dean looked like, you recognized his voice. He just brought a pleasure to so many of us, and be able to make Arnold that happy in his last few months was just a nice experience. Absolutely.
Now, tell me about the process again of contacting all these people. Again, obviously in today's day and age, a little easier to do, but you have the internet, maybe word of mouth. You get one guy, maybe somebody knows somebody else. But this, a Herculean task, because these people, especially if they're older, they're not necessarily online or as accessible as perhaps younger generation. So how difficult was that to contact all these people to get quotes and kind of, you were doing the research, but then to actually hear stories from them?
Well, as you say, it's you network. Once you find one, generally one will know another somewhere. Oh, I think, or one thing you can use is the colleges. When I did a book on the New York Titans, and the colleges were very helpful, the alumni associations. In this case, the colleges were not that helpful, but older people may not be online, but they have landlines.
Right.
Which is,
sure.
And it's a lot easier to find a number on a landline than it is to find the number on a cell phone or however else they communicate. So I got a lot of landlines and a lot of connections, or just a lot of, you get on the internet and you might find maybe some college story, or maybe find out that someone's working somewhere or did work somewhere, and just a lot of digging. You can do a lot of that stuff online now.
Just to digress a minute here, but before we lose this shot, the owner and his lovely wife, who I guess you spoke with quite at length,
Yes.
Pete Savin, correct?
Yes, Elaine is still alive, living in Bloomfield, and it's the same house. And it was very interesting interviewing her, because one of the things the Savins were known for was their parties. They would throw a party for the team, for their friends, and they were very politically connected. They were very active in business, very wealthy business owners, so they knew a lot of people. They knew all the big politicians in Connecticut. John Bailey was friends of theirs, Emil Daddario, and they'd invite all these people to the party, plus the football team. And that was kind of an attraction, but it was in this house. So I went to interview her at this house, and we go, and it's a very unique looking house, which in the 60s must have been very exotic. You up at the top of a hill, and they'd have golf carts bringing people up, and these football players were anywhere from 22 to say 30 years old. Most of them didn't have a lot of money, and they get transported to this scene that's like out of Hollywood for them. They all remember it. They may not remember the games they played in, but they all remember the Savins parties. And to be there at the house, sitting there on the couch with Mrs. Savin, going over her programs and talking about the days. And she's a very delightful woman, very classy.
I heard she likes the word lovely a lot.
Everyone was lovely. She talked to Fred Wallner, who was just a hard-bitten coach, said, "Oh, Fred was a lovely man." No one else ever described Fred Wallner as lovely. She even described me as lovely, which was nice of her.
Oh, Bill Ryczek joining us here for the hour on Studio 411, the book Connecticut Gridiron, Football Minor Leaguers of the 1960s and 1970s, published by McFarland. And for more information, www.mcfarlandpub.com. The book, again, I said, geez, I wonder if they had this much difficulty when they did the history of the Civil War. I mean, there's so much to cover in like a 12 to 14 year period, and you even talk about some other things that we'll get into later about other times leading up to what became the Continental League and then the Atlantic Coast League, et cetera. So kind of help clear me and also the listener. The league itself, the primary league, was the Atlantic Coast League, correct?
There were two. The Continental League and the Atlantic Coast League were the big ones in the Northeast. The Atlantic Coast League was where the Knights and the Jets played in their glory years.
But the Continental one was the earlier one that started back as far as 1962.
Right, I think it was 61, 61, 62, I don't remember. But that was where the Charter Oaks played in, the Continental League.
And the other thing, too, which again I found fascinating, and perhaps some went out of business earlier, maybe a few hung on. I understand the World Football League in the mid-'70s really put the kibosh on a lot of these minor leagues. But, I mean, there was football being played, in a non-NFL, AFL manner from Maine to Florida. I mean, you had a team in Orlando at one time. I don't know, that must have been something playing in that heat.
And they played in the summer. I had teams in Texas. They were all over the place.
So even farther than that.
Oh, out on the West Coast. There was never a shortage of football players, people who want to play football for very little money. And which is understandable in terms of baseball and basketball. You have semi-pro baseball and basketball. You can find players, but football is a violent sport. And what really amazed me was how you take people who may have been professionals, teachers, accountants, who'd go out and risk injury, bang their head for $25 a game. The best years they were making, the average player was making $150 to $200 a game.
Wow.
And you had some, I think $1,000 a game. Harry Theophilides with Bridgeport was the highest I saw. But with the Ansonia team, it was $25 to $30 a game. And you can't believe you would find people to do that, but it wasn't a problem.
Yeah. We're looking at a photo here of the the owner, F. Francis D'Addario. Of course, again, it was funny how, even though I didn't see them play, I brought back memories. We had a friend of the family who had a home on the street that was the main road, and I think it was North Avenue, I forget, in Bridgeport. Their house and their yard went all the way down to the back of Kennedy Stadium. We would even climb this, what looked like a 12-foot fence, and jump over. I mean, I'm thinking of how I didn't wind up with a broken leg. So those kind of things flash back. I remember in high school going to an event where a high school championship game was played at Kennedy Stadium. This was a few years after the league had folded. So I kind of remember these things, remember reading about them in the paper. I don't recall who, if anybody in Bridgeport, if anybody did, it would have been probably WICC, who I would have thought would have carried the games.
Tiny Markle did.
Tiny Markle, okay,
did the
yeah.
games, yeah.
He did the broadcast. Well, he was at WNAB, so maybe it might have been that station.
Yeah,
Later he went to ICC.
It was Tiny Markle.
Yeah, also it was at WNAB 1220, I think, on your AM dial. But anyway, again, these things, I'm sure I probably tuned the dial and might have caught it. And in those days, like you said, you had Wide World of Sports. We were blessed. Yeah. I mean, on a skip, you might see the Red Sox game. You might see double vision, but you'd see the game. And of course, you'd see the Mets and the Yankees. So really, we were down where I was. We were probably more privileged than most to have a variety of different things. So the Knicks, the Rangers. Up towards Hartford, maybe the signal wasn't as great.
I was up in Middletown, and we only got New York stations when the wind was blowing just right, and the air was clear. We did a photo shoot when the book came out down in Kennedy Stadium for one of the papers down there, and it was in January, and it was about close to zero wind chill.
Wow.
So that's my memories of Kennedy Stadium. It was very, very cold.
1971 here, a directory and schedule, again, of the league. One thing I noticed, and we'll touch a little bit more on it later, a program like this now would be half covered in advertisements and promotions. Now, to me, that's where maybe the league might have missed out a little bit. Maybe there's stuff on the inside, but again, a league today would be knee-deep in promotions. I mean, you can't even listen to a baseball game. Strike one. Oh, and by the way, speaking of strike, all of a sudden there's a commercial. There's a, whatever they want to call it. I think today's society is used to it, but you and I listening to a game, you'd hear some pauses. Oh, not now. Pauses is lost revenue. Now it's like you're lucky to hear the game because there's this onslaught of ads and promotions and subtle promotions. It just surprises me that when I see a lot of the programs that there wasn't help in offsetting the costs.
Well, they tried. They were trying to get as many sponsors as they could. In fact, D'Addario would tell his son, if we're buying all their asphalt from these guys, they better put an ad in the program. They better buy box seats.
So it would have been on the inside.
Yeah, it was on the inside. Yeah, they had advertising. In fact, one of the ads, there was someone posing. I think it was a construction company or something with cranes. There was a football player there. And, no one really paid much attention to who it was. It was a fullback for the Knights named Bobby Miranda. And if you remember from the book, Bobby Miranda was he was recruited by Lou Holtz to go down to South Carolina. Didn't have a great college career, but he was in English class, and the teacher said, "If you don't perform in this play, I'm going to fail you." And he didn't want to perform in the play, so somebody in the athletic department said to the teacher, "If you fail him, we're going to get you fired." So Miranda didn't want to get the teacher fired, so he agreed to go in the play, and he loved it. He became a drama major, and he wound up being a character actor in many, many movies.
Wow,
he was in Sister Act. He played Robert Kennedy's driver in the Cuban Missile Crisis film. He was in Miami Vice, all those films. He was a fascinating interview, just his stories. We talked about the football, and he was a very good interview, and nice man, lives out in California. He started telling me all these stories about how he was protecting Sean Connery in a bar fight, how he beat up Robert Blake. And being an interviewer yourself, you can identify with this. I'm hearing all this.
We've got to get him on this show. He's got to tell me.
He would be a fascinating guest if you can get him. And so he's telling me all these stories about the Whoopi Goldberg and the fights they were getting in. Now, he loved Whoopi Goldberg, by the way. But anyway, so I'm thinking, this is fantastic stuff. It doesn't fit in the book, but it's just fantastic stuff to have. So at the time, I had a cell phone, which I was talking to him on, and I had my little tape recorder. And so I went to rewind the tape to transcribe it, and all I had was static. I had the phone and the recorder too close together. So from memory, I got enough of the football stuff, but I lost 20 or 30 minutes of great stories from his Hollywood days. But he was former fullback of the Hartford Knights. And what was most interesting to me, or one of the most interesting things, is what happened to so many of these guys after they played minor league football. How many well-known people there were. If you like wrestling, superstar Billy Graham played under the name of Wayne Coleman for the Waterbury Orbits.
There you go. Yeah.
You had a lot of people.
Later became the Bridgeport Jets, obviously, after Dasilva bought the team. Because I'll get to that. I had a question about Waterbury, but we'll go to this still here. Fred Wallner and owner Pete Savin, again, Hartford Knights, for those who remember back to those days. Fred, not the most genial guy, I guess. But they said he was like that even in the Canadian Football League or wherever it was he coached later on. So
he was. Everybody, I'd ask players, tell me about Fred Wallner. And the first 4 or 5 I talked to all said he was hard-nosed. He used the exact same phrase, hard-nosed. And he was a maniac. And what I've come to, the conclusion I've come to, interviewing football players, doing a couple of books on football, is most of the really good coaches were very maladjusted individuals. They were so focused, they were just not in tune to real life. The people who were really nice guys and well-adjusted weren't as good coaches.
Right, exactly.
And Wallner was just so focused. They said he could tell you what all 11 players were doing on every play. He'd watch a play, he'd tell you, the guard missed his assignment, but the defensive tackle was doing what he was supposed to be doing. The left linebacker, he said he could watch a play and know what all 11 players did.
Amazing.
Fantastic football mind, but just crazy.
Here's another program, the Portland Seahawks and the Hartford Charter Oaks. Now, this was the earlier team from 1965 before the Hartford Knights became in existence. So there was a gap there. Was that in the Continental League? Or
that was a Continental League, and the Charter Oaks were owned by the Brewer family, West Hartford. And the key to succeeding in minor league football has nothing to do with the quality of the football, has nothing to do with promotion. It has to do with an owner that has deep pockets and enough money to absorb losses, because every team lost money. The Brewers had some money, but they didn't have enough.
Right.
The Savins had deep pockets. Dasilva had deep pockets. They were absorbing them. The last year, '73, they were paying the visiting team sometimes. I interviewed Hi-Ho's sister, Joan Benedetto, who unfortunately has also passed away. She was the business manager. And she said the game would be late getting started. Mr. Dasilva would turn around, give me the look, and that meant I had to go and cut checks for the other team, or they weren't going to come out of the field.
Wow.
So at the last year, that was the end. They said when they had to pay both teams.
I definitely got the impression a lot of those teams in these smaller markets, that just, again, maybe they just didn't understand. I think even Pete Savin and Mr. Dasilva, I think they understood, but I still don't think they understood exactly the amount of, the commitment was there, was just that over the long haul, the amount of money that just it was going to take. And the thing was, as we'll talk throughout the interview, is that the attendance. I mean, I think the high, and I was telling somebody off air this, the high for a game, and I think it might have been in either Bridgeport or Hartford, was like 13,000.
Yes.
Which, but then again, too, we'll get into some of my next question, is the Kennedy Stadium was like the Palladium compared to some of these other ballparks. I mean, there was still on this program, they were playing in high school fields. I mean, short of a peewee field, they were lucky if they could go in a dugout. There was no locker rooms. There was no, I mean, they must have got out of the car and into the car in their uniforms.
In some cases they did, and really the nadir for the Hartford Knights was 1972. They played in the Seaboard League. The Atlantic Coast League did not operate in 72. They had 4 teams in 71. And the Seaboard League was the most minor of minor leagues. And that's where they played, in the high school stadiums. One of the goalposts, they had a PVC pipe up there. There was broken glass all over the field. The players would crawl around their hands and knees trying to pick the broken glass out of the field. Just terrible places to play. They'd dress in a garage down the street. Orlando was a very nice place to play. Bridgeport was a nice place to play. The Bridgeport Stadium was very new at the time.
I was only 4 years old when that stadium, when they started playing there. I mean, even as I remember as a kid, I thought, again, it pales to the ones today because a lot of the seats were like concrete or whatever, but the point was everything was new. It was, nice, freshly painted. The field was maintained immaculately. It was just... It wasn't, okay, we got the high school team coming. Can you guys wrap up the game? I mean, that's the kind of impression I got with some of these.
In the Seaboard League, it was. And the Atlantic Coast, there was always a struggle. There were always a few good teams. And what's interesting, you talked about the small market teams. There are a lot of small markets that played a lot better than big markets. The Pottstown Firebirds. If someone talks about minor league football, one team they may remember is the Pottstown Firebirds. And the reason they remember them is because there was a documentary done by NFL Films in 1970, which was played before the Super Bowl, about the Pottstown Firebirds, and that really gave impetus to the character.
Steve Sable.
Steve Sable,
who was no, he just passed recently.
Steve passed recently. Ed
was the father, and
yeah.
I remember as a kid, Steve was the practically the baby. I mean, also now look all these years later, and Ed of course passed several years back, and now Steve is gone as well.
Yeah.
But here's a shot to defensive tackle Bill Costin, number 74 there in white on the left, stops fullback Fred McCauley for a short gain. And there you go. That was a game between correct me if I'm wrong, that was the Bridgeport Jets against, the Jets, and I'm not sure who that was. Could have been against the Knights. But
it looks like a Knights helmet, but I'm not sure.
But again, there you go. So on the surface, looks like NFL caliber, folks.
Well, they were good players, and what really strikes you if you talk about minor league football is the very, very fine line between an NFL player and somebody playing for the Hartford Knights. And one of the chapters I called The Right Place at the Right Time. You have so many talented players who just didn't get the right opportunity. They were in camp with a team that had too many people at their position. They got hurt at the wrong time. And Bob Tucker, who became
just going to say that, Bob Tucker.
all pro with the New York Giants for many years. Bob almost didn't make it. He got cut by he was a free agent from a small school, Bloomsburg State, got cut by the Patriots, got cut by the Eagles, had great seasons in the ACFL. And with the Giants, he was about to get cut again, but they were getting blown out by the Steelers one night, the first game in Three River Stadium. And finally, Alex Webster, who was a coach, said, get these guys out of here, put in the scrubs and run the ball. Tucker went in, blocked really well, opened everybody's eyes, started the next game, and all of a sudden, he was a starter.
And amazing, because I didn't know he had played, in these leagues. But Bob played 11 years, and I remember him, and he played, of course, on some bad Giant teams in the 70s, especially. And it's funny, I don't recall the year. I'm going to say 81, 82, but again, he just missed the Parcell. He probably ended when Perkins or somebody was the coach.
Yeah, his last year was 77, I think, with the Giants.
Oh, really? Okay, so then I thought he was there later. So yeah, he even missed that debacle against the Eagles when they lost the game.
Yes, by a year. But what amazed me is that here's a guy who was that good, and had it not been for that one game, that lucky break, he would have been back in Pottstown. He probably would have been teaching. He said, I wouldn't have stayed in forever. And so many guys just didn't get that opportunity and had the ability like that.
This, again, marvelous book, Connecticut Gridiron. Bill Ryczek joining us here for the hour on Studio 411, football minor leaguers of the 1960s and 70s. And there's a passage here. What does it all mean? Minor league football in the 60s meant quite a bit to the men who played it. The story of most minor leaguers is one of near misses, an injury, an overloaded roster, a quirk of fate. Placed them at Nolan Field in Ansonia, know it well, instead of playing at Shea Stadium before 50,000 people. Why do they continue? Nick DeFelice, I beg your pardon, put it best, quote, "It's hard to give up the game. If I could just do it over, run through that tunnel just one more time." I read that and I was struck because there's a name that's given now. Of course, back then they just thought it was just getting it out of your blood, but a lot of players, there was even recently in 2016, Rashad Salam, Heisman Trophy winner, who played briefly with the Chicago Bears and was found deceased in a park and apparently never quite made the adjustment despite all the early fame he had. And there's a term now, and I can't grasp at it right now, that a lot of ex-players that have gone into kind of working with ex-players or whatever, that again, there is this this thing, like in many professions, the difficulty of kind of getting that out of your blood. And I think that's evident even in that quote.
Well, that was Nick's comment. That was my choice for the title of the book. It's hard to give up the game. And the publisher felt that they needed something that was more descriptive, so people would understand what the title was. But that was going to be mine. It's hard to give up the game. And you think of a profession, and for so many people, the thing that's the most important to them in their life is over when they're 22 or maybe 25.
The average in the NFL is what, three years.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
and if you're in the minor leagues, you're done. You get out of college, you want to do something all your life, and they tell you you're not good enough.
We can't get a tight shot on this. I'll hold it up anyway. There's a gentleman here in this three shot. This was an excerpt from a Time magazine from 2011. Gentleman here with the number 50. Bill doesn't even know this, and again, I thought of you when I was doing research. This is the late legendary sax player, a Rock and Roll Hall of Famer, Clarence Clemons, who of course many of you know that played with Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band, who passed away. Got to meet him one time, signed an album for me at a charity event I was doing, and marvelous guy, 6'5", weighed 270, and believe me, he was that size when I met him too, back around 2010. A gifted young athlete, grew up in Norfolk, Virginia, attended Maryland State College, now known as Maryland Eastern Shore. And why do I tell you this? Well, I tell you that because for a brief time he played in a semi-pro league in New Jersey and went to school on a music and sports scholarship, and then almost, as you said, almost made it to the Browns. The problem was the day before camp he suffered injuries in an auto accident. And as he was quoted as saying when they did the Super Bowl halftime in 2009, a couple of years before he passed, quote, "Maybe if I had made the Browns, I might have taken them there." Now again, there you go, Clarence Clemons. And again, he was playing for a team, down a little further south from where this book really talks about. But again, these teams were all over the place.
And that's the pull of sports too, and how you say it's hard to give up the game. And even people who are famous, and he was obviously very famous in music, I think if you gave Billy Crystal the choice of giving up his comedy career and having a 10-year career with the Yankees, he'd probably take it.
In a heartbeat.
Just the whole camaraderie of sports. And that's what you get when you talk to these ex-athletes, how much they missed it. And what's interesting, and I've done a lot of ex-baseball players, a lot of retired football players, and they say there's two things they really like. The competition, going up against someone else trying to measure yourself, the camaraderie. And football players have a third one, and it's the violence. They love hitting people, most of them. A few of the receivers, quarterbacks didn't. But it's the one thing is missing from baseball. You talk to most players, what did you like about it? I love to hit people.
Sure.
You could hit people and not get in trouble. It was legitimate.
You had a player in the book, and I'm blanking right now who it was, that basically wore a cast. And I'm talking the kind that was like, the plaster
Otis
Sistrunk. I didn't know played in these leagues before he went on to a long career with, I believe, Oakland.
Oakland.
And was in some of those beer ads that were back in the 70s and 80s, and did some movie work as well. But what I remember is watching a Jets and Colts game, like late 60s, Unitas, Namath, one of their many wars. And one of their players, besides Bubba Smith with the Colts, was Mike Curtis. And remember, this was allowed then. He would tackle people, and there was a guy that broke free, kind of like this gentleman here is running around the flank there, headed his way. And Curtis, and he had a broken arm, but was still playing. Now I don't think that would be allowed. I know the cast wouldn't. Held the arm out, and I'm telling you, I'm watching it on NBC, and he clotheslined him, and it looked like a Roadrunner cartoon. The head was still here, and the body was, it was like the body was still moving, and it was like, and I thought, wow, this is fierce. Of course, now I'm sure that's no longer allowed.
It was a much more violent game than, and the big thing in the NFL now, of course, is concussions, concern over concussions. And then, as you remember, watching games at that time, you'd see somebody go down, everybody would huddle over them, and they'd get up, and the announcer would say, nothing serious, just got his bell rung, which is a concussion. And they'd get up, and players come back in, and everybody knew. They didn't know where they were, but they were playing on instinct. Sure. And the quarterback would come in, and they'd call a simpler game plan because the quarterback was a little.
Look at poor Jim McMahon. Played in the 80s, 90s, whatever. Finished with the. Actually, he was the backup quarterback. I don't know if you know that when the 96, 97, whatever that Super Bowl. I think it was January '97 with the Green Bay Packers. He was back up to Brett Favre.
He went everywhere after he went to the Bears.
But he's still alive now. But on a good day, he might know his own name. It's a shame. 1966 championship game, Atlantic Coast Football League, Virginia Sailors versus the Lowell, I'm assuming that's Lowell, Mass.
Lowell, Mass,
Lowell,
yes.
Mass Giants, not at the Superdome, but at George Washington High School Stadium in Alexandria, Virginia. At November 66. So you might have got a night in the 40s, perhaps. It wasn't an ice bowl, perhaps.
Well, I don't know if you were planning to get to it later, but the Snow Bowl, the famous Snow Bowl in Hartford.
70,
1970, where they had a couple feet of snow in Hartford. They played, and that was part of the Pottstown Firebird film. And what they did, they were out there, and the players were slipping. They were trying all kinds of shoes. The Knights couldn't stand up, but the Firebirds seemed to have great traction. And what they had done is, when you have football spikes, you've got like a nail, and then you screw the plastic spikes onto them. What they had done is unscrew those plastic spikes, so you just had the metal nails. And so they had great traction, but when you not only cut through the ice, you cut through skin, you cut through anybody else you
also aerated the grass as well as I'm sure some flesh to go along with it.
They aerated a lot of flesh, and players are thinking, gee, how come this guy isn't slipping? And then they'd go down and they realize, my leg's bleeding. What happened? It was illegal, of course, but nobody caught them. And they won 31-0, and the players, Nick DeFelice is still upset about that. It's been 46 years, and you talked to him about it, and if you called him today and said, Nick, what are those Pottstown guys who took his comment was something like they should have made them play in their damn bare feet.
Was he at the reunion? I have to ask.
Nick I've seen Nick a couple times, and it's as Nick is good friends with Larry McHugh, and he and Larry played at and Larry, of course, is the head of the Connecticut college system now, and is a longtime coach at Xavier. He and Nick are very good friends. They were guards together in Ansonia, so I got to know Nick through that, and I've kept in touch with him. He's a very dynamic guy, and he still looks pretty good. He's mid-70s and still looks pretty good.
1963, you bring up Ansonia, the then Ansonia Black Knights, which again did not have a long tenure in the league at that time, but a gentleman named Jim Gabriel, I don't know if I've ever heard this in the NFL or AFL, was actually arrested during a game. Did I read that? Oh, after.
After the game, yes. He was holding up gas stations in Milford on Route 1 during the game, which no one could understand, and they felt he was mentally ill because he had a good job. He was working at Sikorsky, didn't seem to need the money. He was up there. His wife was in California, and he was considered somewhat of a pro prospect. And the police came after the game. Pudge Hankel, who was a backup quarterback, and eventually went on to become an attorney and a very prominent figure in Cleveland. He ended up being a campaign manager for Gary Hart when he was running for president.
There's Nick right there.
There is Nick.
Ask and you shall receive.
Yeah, he doesn't look exactly like that now, but he still looks good. But anyway, the police came after the game, hauled Gabriel off, and he wound up in prison, serving time in prison.
Some
Long
other
time.
notables, I was amazed. Another gentleman who was became famous even in his post-baseball umpiring career, Ron Luciano, wrote several books,
Yes.
quite a character himself. He played briefly for a team, I think it was somewhere in Jersey or Virginia.
It was out in New York. It was there was one team that I can't remember the name. It was 62.
Yeah.
Was it Herkimer? They played all the ex-Syracuse guys went there. He was a former Syracuse
You even
guy.
had at least one that I remember, Heisman Trophy winner Joe Bellino of Navy
Joe.
played in the Continental League, correct? Yeah.
Joe
yeah.
played. Yeah.
Amazing, And again, it just guys, as you said, they either were trying to like hold out hope that they would still get a chance to play, which I could see why. You had the fledgling AFL, which eventually became successful especially after Super Bowl III, when Willie Namath said, "Hey, we're going to win," and everybody's, yeah, sure. But to play the Colts, you're going to beat the Colts,
Yeah.
and hey, he delivered,
Well, the AFL is an interesting story in itself. I did a book on the New York Titans, so I studied a lot about the early AFL, and they were the ultimate in deep pockets. Talking about people who could absorb losses, which they did. They had Lamar Hunt, who was one of the richest people and came from one of the richest families in the world. Bud Adams, Baron Hilton, I'm sorry, but Conrad's son, who could absorb those losses, and that's what you need if you want to start a sports league.
Connecticut Gridiron, the book. Bill Ryczek joining us here for the hour on Studio 411. Football, we're talking football minor leaguers of the 1960s and 1970s here throughout the state of Connecticut, and certainly the teams in many other states that came through, and Connecticut, as well as the road games, obviously. I digress for a minute. Atlantic Coast Football League, hi-ho, we knew back in the day. The Bridgeport Jets versus, this was in the later years, probably the last season, if I recall, September of '73, the Western Mass Pioneers. Now, was that in that, oh no, that was then when they came back into
That was
the
when the
league.
ACFL
That was
came
their
back, yes.
That was their last year, yeah. And I don't know, for some reason I thought the league continued later than that, but as you said, then I started getting into, you get into high school and college and kind of you lose track of these things. But yeah.
Bridgeport played in '74. I think they played in the Seaboard League. There was no more ACFL after '73.
Boy, that's a shame. The question I wanted to touch on before, why didn't the football success in an area like Connecticut that is so crazy about its high school teams, like for instance the All-American Valley, Shelton, Seymour,
Yeah.
Derby, Ansonia, Seymour, I'm forgetting a few, I'm sure, along the way. Again, you would have thought that given when they were playing the games, and I don't know if we mentioned it, they played primarily on Saturday nights, that you would think that they would have drawn better than they did.
That's what they thought. And I asked people in the Valley that, because the Ansonia Valley is they're crazy about football. They would go in those days to watch practice. They'd get 1,000 people at the high school practice. And Rich Marazzi, who is, I don't know if you know Rich. Rich is a sports guy.
I actually produced a sports talk show 30 plus years ago, and Rich was actually a guest on the show. He wouldn't remember me, but I was the producer and guest coordinator there, and Rich had a book at that time about the Yankees, I think, and Rich was a young man then, as we were all at that time.
Yes,
yeah.
well, he is. Rich is a very knowledgeable guy, and I asked him. I said, Rich, why do you think football didn't make it in Ansonia when they're absolutely mad about football in Ansonia? And he had a number of theories. One was that they played at night, which they were not used to doing. It was Saturday, and also they went to the game on Saturday. They watched an NFL game on Saturday. Maybe it was too much football. And he also said there was not much offense. And if you look at the Ansonia team, they had a very poor offense. They didn't score a lot. One of the reasons being, and Rich pointed out, that in order to have a good offense, you'd need a lot of cohesion, a lot of practice. And these guys couldn't practice that much. They were all working. They're coming in after work and they're tired, and you get a couple of days, and a lot of them didn't show up for practice. So it's hard to get an offense going. Defense, you just got to have a lot of aggression. You don't need as much practice. So the offenses weren't that good. So you've got, it's nighttime, it's a little cold, you've got games that aren't very high scoring. For whatever reason, they just didn't come out. They started out maybe 3,000 or 4,000 a game, and then it dwindled
down from there.
When I did a talk at a library a year ago or so on the book, and this woman came up to me afterwards, and I think beforehand, and introduced herself. Turned out she was the daughter of Frank Berlinger, who ran the Ansonia Black Knights and had been a cheerleader. That's what the whole cheerleading squad was. It was all the children and the friends of the owners.
Oh, sure. Just
and
like with the Darios,
Savins.
it was all a family operation.
Yes,
Yeah.
the Darios had David was a ball boy, and the Savins, the daughters were the cheerleaders, and it was all of them. So anyway, she showed up, and she had been a cheerleader for the Black Knights, which was a really nice to have somebody at the talk who was part of it, and you make them part of it, and have them chime in.
So many great stories, again, as a reader will find in this book, Connecticut Gridiron by Bill Ryczek. Another gentleman, again, I hark back to my old producing days that I got to speak, and of course, like we did, you get to speak more in depth with them off camera or off air when you're lining them up as guests, was Albert B. Happy Chandler. I actually got to, on the 3 or 4 occasions, speak to him. This was back early 80s. He was in Kentucky, sipping whiskey. I'm sure he lived to a ripe old age. And he had been a former baseball commissioner. He was there prior to Jackie Robinson, so 30s, early 40s, and I guess he ticked off the owners a little bit too much, so they kind of replaced him, quickly with that. But he was a former commissioner in the
Continental League. Yeah, he was 1 year, and
1 year, yeah.
He had a dispute with the owners. He wanted to make it a third major league. He kept talking about the Continental League being a third major league with the AFL and NFL, bigger stadiums, higher payrolls, and he did not want to be a farm system. But the owners realized they could not make it, and after a year of losing money, they said,
not enough deep
happy.
pockets, yeah.
No.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Jimmy King Corcoran, right? We just saw real quickly there, but anyway, he was a guy that seemed like he had a lot of talent, but just I don't know, was a little bit of a loose cannon there. Or just
he was ahead of his time.
Yeah.
He was a self-promoter. He was an egotist, and that's fine in today's game. Now, the more you promote yourself, the better. You see Odell Beckham out there doing his dance and kissing the net, and everybody loves it. But in those days, any type of showboating was frowned upon. You didn't go in the end zone and do a dance. You didn't do a spike. And if you talk to the old football players about today's players, you say, "Are you jealous of all the money?" I say, "No, they deserve it. That's fine if they make that money. What about what don't you like about them?" The one thing they don't like, the showboating. Is that if in our day, somebody would have taken their head off if they did that kind of stuff.
Now, I'm going to assume, I think if I read correctly, it was one season. There was a team, it sounds like a movie, a team in Brooklyn.
Yes.
And I was impressed. Andy Robustelli, after a stellar career with the Giants primarily, and Andy, who passed away several years ago, of course, was very big in the travel agency business in Stamford.
Right.
And was involved there. And then I was stunned, but again, why should I be? Because Happy Chandler was involved too, but Jackie Robinson was part of that Brooklyn team. Not as a player, obviously, but in the front office.
He was in the front office. He didn't do a lot, but he had his name. And the team, of course, was the Brooklyn Dodgers. They took the old Dodger name. And Jackie was involved in the front office. In fact, I said they had more celebrities in minor league football management than they did in the game. Johnny Most was involved with the Boston Sweepers, the old Celtics
the
announcer.
Long-time announcer, yeah.
And
Havlicek steals the ball. Yeah.
One of the legendary characters. Those of us who got our sports on the radio, no one will ever forget Johnny Most. If you turned on the television and listened to Johnny Most on the radio, you would swear he was not describing the game that was going on.
There was a guy, and I don't know if he's still there, that was doing Cleveland Cavalier games like, a few years ago, who has been there. If he's not now, I'm not sure. But I know he was there during the first LeBron regime. And he was another one, kind of a Johnny Most type. He had kind of a real gravelly voice, and I used to pick it up on a skip, as we called it, driving home sometimes after 7 o'clock at night, and I'd be like mesmerized. And this is like, within the last 10 years. Old AM radio, you get some great skips, listen to a Baltimore Orioles game or a Cavaliers game, and some of these stations are like at night, they're like major powerhouses. It's amazing. Here in Connecticut, we've got only a handful, and they never really do any sports. ESPN, of course, but I'm talking way back before any of that. John Dockery, Harvard star, AA player with the Red Sox, did not know that. Later NFL player. with the Jets.
That's not John, by the way.
No,
on the
no,
screen.
we're going to get to her in a second. Ms. How do you pronounce her last name?
Palinkas. Pat
Palinkas, yeah,
Palinkas.
Orlando Panthers. But later a broadcaster, and of course I grew up with John Dockery, with Bill Mazer on Sports Extra for, it had to be close to 20 years. And I know John did sideline reporting for CBS for a long time. So here's a guy that had a marvelous career, but
He
boy.
did. And he a pretty good ball player, too. And again, almost didn't make it. He wound up, he was with the Bridgeport Jets, and somebody got hurt with the New York Jets. They were a farm club. He got called up with 3 weeks to go, wound up playing in Super Bowl III, which was a great experience. And talk about people just barely not making it. There was a guy who just made it, and he said it was unbelievable. Talk about also tracking people down. You asked me earlier how I found these people. It was quite an ordeal getting John. And in fact, if he told me, he said if I'd been this elusive as a running back, I would have been in the Hall of Fame. And I apologized. But he was a great interview. Once I got him, I knew a lawyer in New York who knew him, and I just kept trying and trying, and eventually he responded, and he was a great interviewer once I got him.
Very good.
Yeah.
Now we're talking about the first female and only perhaps in the Continental/Atlantic Coast League, that whole period of which the book is based on. Miss Palinkas, am I pronouncing it?
Palinkas, yes.
Yeah, was the placeholder, right?
The first woman to play professional football against men. And I interviewed her and her husband on the phone, and it takes a certain type of woman to get out there, put on a helmet, shoulder pads, and compete against very large men. And you spend about 30 seconds on the phone with Pat Palinkas, and you know, this is your gal. She's just funny. She's very feisty. She's a retired elementary school teacher at this point. And her husband wanted to be a place kicker. And he tried out with the Orlando Panthers, didn't do that well, and he said, well, the holder you had for me wasn't that good. I could do better if I had my own holder, who, by the way, is my wife. That's who I've been practicing with. So the Orlando Panthers were in great, dire financial straits. They needed some money. They needed some excitement. I said, well, bring her along. And they immediately saw, here's some public relations gimmick for us.
It's like Bill Veeck all over again.
It was exactly like Bill Veeck, Bill Veeck's greatest dream. So they signed them both up, and everybody knew about it. Got a lot of publicity. She played her first game as an exhibition game against the Bridgeport Jets in Orlando. The networks were covering it. The New York Times was there. Everybody was there. And for a minor league football game, that's a big deal. So anyway, toward the end of the first half, they score for the first time. She goes into hold for the extra point. And before the game, she'd been very nervous. And she also it was kind of awkward in the dressing room, so they kind of told me to go over in the corner and close my eyes. But the doctor said, you're really nervous. Why don't you take a Valium? So she took half a Valium. And apparently it was bad and it was good. It was bad because she was probably a little sleepy. The snap came back. First of all, she kneeled down and turned around and said the 3 words to her husband. Walter Cronkite said, you'll probably never hear these 3 words on a football field again. She said, you ready, honey? Well, Honey was ready, but Pat wasn't. The snap came back. She fumbled it. So she's trying to get the ball up. It's gone on the ground. And meanwhile, Wally Florence, who's a linebacker for the Jets, comes in. And he told everybody before the game that he was really upset about this. He said, who is this woman coming in, making a mockery of our game? I'm trying to earn a living, and she's screwing up the whole game. I'm going to take her out. So here was what he had dreamed of. She's trying to get the ball up. She can't get it focused. He came in and did a helmet-to-helmet on her.
Wow.
Took her out, and I was interviewing the Palinkas as her husband. Steve said, it was really kind of cool. Her head snapped way back, and he said, wasn't that cool?
But she was like, hey, she took it it like a pro, and like, hey, he fair hit, I guess, in those days.
Yeah, well, she was down on the
field. Now it would have been a flag of some kind because of the concussion thing.
Would have been a helmet to helmet. But she was down on the ground, then popped up, and after that, held successfully, played 2 exhibition games, and she was going all over the country doing, she's on the talk shows, the Merv Griffin shows, all the late night shows. She had her own radio show predicting the football results. And just was a celebrity for about a month, and then did not play again. But she made her claim to fame. First woman to play against men, and You
great.
can only be first once.
As Carson used to say, I did not know that, but I do know after I read this book, Connecticut Gridiron, football minor leaguers of the 60s and 70s. Bill Ryczek joining us here for the remaining moments on Studio 411. Real quick, I work with a gentleman who actually worked for a company, and I'm blanking right now, a salesman, and he knew Manchester Wheeler. And this was, of course, after Manchester played in the league and was later GM of the Hartford Knights, whatever. Yep. Interesting character. We talked off air about him, who's still alive as we tape and living in Maine. Mm-hmm. And one of my colleagues said, yeah, I knew him, and was asking about him. Is he still with us, this, that, and the other? And I said, yeah. I said, he's semi-retired.
So we had a sad story about Manch. We had 2 reunions. We had the second one about a year ago or 2 years ago. I can't remember which. Right after the book came out. And Manch was supposed to be there. He called, said he couldn't make it. His wife had died that afternoon, which was a real shame. He was a very nice man, a good interview, very helpful, and he was the quarterback when the Knights won their first championship, and they won the championship.
Here's some of the mementos that are kicking around there, probably on eBay. Again, Hartford Knights T-shirts, signed footballs. I mean, just quite a collection. People talk about like the, loyalty of the old Hartford, Whalers fans. Well, again, we'll take it even a step farther back. The Hartford Knights, first team in Hartford, at least to my memory, that other than college perhaps, that won a championship of some kind, 1968, and went to the championship, 3-4 years in a row, I believe?
They went 68, 69, 70, 71, and they won the Seaboard League in 72.
With a 17-0
record. A little tainted. The league wasn't that good. They were just a dominant team.
Again, we're rounding out our interview here with Bill. Again, just some other points. Again, we'll have to have him on. Actually, I'm getting ideas about doing a little reunion on this show. We'll get Bill and get a few people maybe in studio on the phone and via satellite. We'll do some nice memories. But the book talks about integration of minorities into football, gays in the sport. Again, some of the ones that again are very much not talked about. It talks about people like we said, Otis Sistrunk, Joe Klecko, the longtime Jets defensive Pro Bowler, so many more. We talked about Ron Luciano. I mean, even the gentleman, he was one of the first black quarterbacks. James Harris was with a team at some point. I think so.
I thought he was straight to the NFL.
No, he was with some minor league team, and there was something. It wasn't in this area though, and I was like, wow. And I'm thinking, wow, he must have. Again, I know the craziness he went through in the early days of the NFL in his time. Anyway, I can only imagine. But anyway, to be continued another time.
The other thing that really surprised me, you mentioned, was the Vince Lombardi was very supportive of gay players.
Sure. Absolutely.
Which was you would not think, given his personality at that time.
Well, Bill, a pleasure, and we're going to have you back for sure. And he's done other books, just a plethora of information and great stuff. The book again, Connecticut Gridiron by McFarland, football minor leaguers in the 60s and 70s. Writes about baseball, football, Yankees, Mets, New York Titans, deep pockets, not so deep pockets. You name it, Bill covers it. And again, a pleasure. We thank you for making time to come visit us.
I always love talking about these things.
Absolutely. And we will love talking to you folks. We thank you very much for joining us here on Studio 411. Larry Dasilva is my name, your host, and we look forward to seeing you again next time. So take care. Have a great week.